The sound of breaking glass cut through Rosie's diner like a gunshot. "Clean it up, sweetheart, now!" Sergeant First Class Tanner Briggs shoved the jagged remains of a pint glass across the table with the back of his hand, sending a spray of beer and shards skittering toward the edge. 4 Marines sat around the booth, their laughter rolling over each other like waves crashing against a seawall. Corporal Kyle Drake, the one who had knocked the glass off the table the instant the waitress set the tray down, leaned back with his arms folded across his chest. His grin was the grin of a boy who had never once been told the word no by anyone who mattered. Elara Vasquez said nothing. She knelt on the linoleum, her slight frame folding down beside the booth with a quietness that made her almost disappear. Her fingers found the shards one at a time, precise, unhurried, each piece lifted and placed into the palm of her other hand with the kind of deliberate care that seemed out of place for a woman cleaning up someone else's mess. A sliver of glass bit into her index finger. Blood welled in a thin red line across the pad. She did not look down. She did not flinch. Rosie's diner on a Friday night was a living, breathing thing. 23 people packed into a narrow rectangle of red vinyl booths, chrome-edged counters, and fluorescent light that buzzed just loud enough to remind you it existed. The walls told stories that the customers never bothered to read anymore. A faded American flag pinned above the register, black and white photographs of young men in uniforms from 3 different wars, a framed newspaper clipping about a local boy who had come home from Iwo Jima missing a leg and gained a barbershop. The air tasted of fryer grease, old coffee, and something sharper, the metallic tang of arrogance that always settled over the place when the Marines from Camp Pendleton rolled in after a late training exercise. At the farthest corner of the diner, a man with silver hair sat alone. He wore civilian clothes, a canvas jacket over a plain shirt, and his coffee had gone cold long ago. His eyes never left the waitress. Not the way a customer watches a server waiting for a refill. This was the gaze of someone counting down to something that had not happened yet. Briggs leaned toward her, his elbows spreading across the table like a man staking territory. "Hey, I'm talking to you. Are you deaf or just mute?" Elle stood, her spine straightened, shoulders squared, arms at her sides, hands open, fingers relaxed but aligned. Not the posture of a waitress. For a fraction of a heartbeat, her eyes swept the room in a single, unbroken arc, left to right, front door to kitchen pass-through, fire exit to cash register, cataloging every face, every angle, every obstruction. Then her gaze returned to Briggs as if it had never left. "I'll bring you a fresh glass right away, sir." Her voice was level. But the way she said "sir" did not carry the deference of a woman serving beer to strangers. It carried the cadence of something older, deeper, something trained into the marrow of a person through repetition and consequence. Briggs did not notice. He had never been taught to listen for things he was not expecting to hear. But the silver-haired man at the corner table noticed. His hand tightened around his cold coffee cup until the ceramic creaked. In the next 20 minutes, everything inside this diner would change, and not a single person sitting in those booths, not even the most combat-hardened among them, would be prepared for what was about to happen. Elle pushed through the swinging kitchen door, and the noise of the dining room fell away like a curtain dropping. The kitchen was small, hot, and cluttered with the organized chaos of a restaurant running on instinct rather than systems. Maria Santos stood at the prep station, a sturdy woman of 58 whose arms bore the evidence of decades spent lifting cast-iron skillets and wrestling with industrial ovens. She had owned Rosie's for 22 years, ever since her husband, a Marine sergeant, had died of a heart attack at 49. She had kept his name on the building and his photograph behind the register, and she treated every waitress who walked through her door like a daughter she was trying to protect from a world that did not deserve them. "You okay, mija?" This Maria asked without turning around because she had the ears of a woman who had raised 4 children and managed drunken Marines for 2 decades. "I'm fine," Elle said. She held her cut finger under the faucet, and the cold water turned pink as it spiraled down the drain. What she did next was subtle enough that Maria, focused on plating a burger, did not see it. Elle dried the wound, then reached beneath the counter for the first aid kit, a plastic box with a cracked lid, and supplies that were mostly expired. She opened it, found a small bottle of antiseptic, and cleaned the cut with the systematic precision of someone debriding a wound, rather than treating a kitchen scratch. Antiseptic applied in a radial pattern outward from the wound center. Sterile gauze, not the adhesive bandage that sat right on top. Pressure applied for exactly 15 seconds. Wrap secured with a single strip of medical tape torn to precise length. It was the kind of wound care you learned in places where a cut finger was the least of your problems. She closed the first aid kit, washed her hands for a second time, and returned to the dining room carrying a fresh pint glass and a posture of studied insignificance that made her nearly invisible as she moved between the tables. The booth where the Marines sat occupied the prime real estate of Rosie's Diner, directly beneath the largest photograph on the wall, a formation of young men at Camp Pendleton in 1967, their faces still smooth with the particular kind of confidence that had not yet been tested. Briggs had chosen the booth deliberately, the way certain men chose the biggest chair in every room they entered. He sat with his back to the wall, legs spread wide, one arm draped over the backrest in a posture that was half parade rest and half territorial claim. He was 34, thick-necked, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same sandstone as the California cliffs. His sleeves were rolled above the elbows, displaying forearms roped with muscle and decorated with a single tattoo, the eagle, globe, and anchor of the Marine Corps, rendered in the kind of crisp black ink that suggested it had been done at a proper shop by someone who understood that some symbols were not meant to be embellished. To his left, Lieutenant Diana Cross sat with her legs crossed and her phone angled to capture anything that might make a good story. She was 28, blonde, the kind of woman who wore her officer's bars like a tiara and treated enlisted personnel like set dressing. She had a master's degree in communications and a habit of filming people without their consent, both of which she considered evidence of her intelligence. Drake sat across from Briggs, flipping a steak knife between his fingers in a restless, fidgeting rhythm that never quite stopped. He was wiry, sharp-faced, the kind of soldier who volunteered for every dangerous assignment, not out of courage, but out of a desperate need to prove something to a father who had never been impressed. Beside him, Private First Class Jennings occupied the smallest portion of the booth, laughing at everything Briggs said with the eager reflexes of a man who understood that proximity to power was its own form of protection. Elle set the fresh pint glass in front of Briggs without a word. "Took you long enough," Cross said, not looking up from her phone. "You know, where I come from, waitresses who can't keep up with orders don't last a week. Maybe you should go back to wherever you came from and learn to take orders properly." The word wherever landed like a stone dropped into still water. It rippled outward through the surrounding tables, reaching ears that either agreed, disagreed, or simply did not care enough to react. Elle's expression did not change. She reached across the table to collect the empty plates, and as she did, her hands arranged the silverware into a formation, knife and fork parallel on the plate, blade facing inward, positioned with the automatic precision of someone who had spent years setting mess trays in a military dining facility. Briggs noticed the arrangement without understanding it. His eyes narrowed for a moment, then dismissed the observation as coincidence. He had bigger games to play tonight than noticing how the help stacked dishes. "Get us another round," he said. "And this time, don't take all night." "Yes, sir." That cadence again. Sir with the weight of protocol behind it. Not servility. Something else entirely. The front door of the diner swung open, and the temperature of the room shifted. Master Gunnery Sergeant Cole Harlan stepped inside like a weather system making landfall. He was 52 years old, but the years sat on him the way rust sits on railroad iron, weathering the surface without diminishing the structure beneath. 28 years in the Marine Corps had carved deep lines around his eyes and stripped the fat from his frame until what remained was sinew, bone, and the particular kind of quiet that came from having seen enough violence to understand that most noise was unnecessary. He wore a dark polo shirt and khaki pants, civilian enough to blend in, but his bearing gave him away. The way he entered a room, scanning left to right with practiced economy, checking sight lines and exit points before selecting his seat. The Marines at Briggs' booth straightened unconsciously as he passed, the way iron filings align to a magnet they cannot see but cannot resist. Briggs half rose from his seat before Harlan waved him down with a flick of two fingers, the universal gesture of a senior enlisted man who had no interest in ceremony outside of a parade ground. Harlan chose a stool at the counter, positioning himself with his back to the wall and a clear view of the entire dining room. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, and did not open a menu. When Elle brought his cup, he accepted it with a nod and nothing more. But his eyes tracked her as she moved away, lingering for a moment on her posture, on the way she carried the coffee pot with her left hand, while her right remained free and positioned slightly forward, the way someone who had been trained in close-quarters movement kept their dominant hand available. He filed the observation and said nothing. Before we continue with this incredible story of hidden warriors walking among us, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next, because this quiet little waitress is about to do something that will make every Marine in that diner question everything they thought they knew about courage. Trust me, the reveal coming up will absolutely blow your mind. Now, back to Rosie's diner. At the end of the counter, farthest from the door, a man in his late 60s sat hunched over a plate of meatloaf that he had been pushing around with a fork for the better part of an hour. Pete Ramos, known to the regulars as Doc, wore a trucker cap so faded that its original color was a matter of personal interpretation, and a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times the plaid had surrendered to a general impression of softness. He had a face like a topographic map of hard living, every line a ridge, every shadow a valley, and his hands trembled with the faint vibration of a man whose nervous system had absorbed more explosions than any human body was designed to process. He called Elle by name when she passed. "Elle, you want me to handle those kids for you?" She shook her head, and something that might have been a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "I'm good, Doc. Thanks." He watched her walk away with an expression that held more layers than a man eating meatloaf in a roadside diner had any right to possess. It was the look of someone who knew the end of a story that had not yet been told, and was deciding whether to let it unfold naturally or to intervene before anyone got hurt. The evening settled into its rhythm. Orders came in, plates went out, and the noise level in Rosie's diner rose with the temperature and the blood alcohol content. Briggs held court at his booth like a minor king dispensing judgment from a vinyl throne. He told stories about training exercises that grew more dangerous with each retelling, about marksmanship scores that improved with every beer, about the officer who had tried to discipline him and had been quietly transferred to a desk job in Okinawa. His audience laughed when expected, agreed when required, and silently calculated the cost of disagreement, which was always higher than the cost of compliance. Elle moved between the tables with the fluidity of water finding its path around stones. She refilled coffee cups without being asked, cleared plates before they accumulated, and navigated the narrow aisles of the diner with a spatial awareness that went beyond the requirements of her job. Twice, when other servers would have collided with swinging kitchen doors or overloaded bus trays, she adjusted her trajectory a fraction of a second before the obstruction appeared, as if she had mapped the probability of every moving object in the room and positioned herself in the spaces between. No one noticed. No one ever noticed. Briggs called her back to the table. "Hey, sweetheart, come here." Elle approached. She stood at the end of the booth with her order pad held loosely in her left hand, her pen in her right, and her weight balanced evenly on both feet, in a stance that any drill instructor would have recognized as the foundation of a combat-ready position. "My buddy Drake here says you messed up his order. He asked for the burger medium rare and you brought it well done. That right, Drake?" Drake nodded with exaggerated seriousness. "Practically charcoal, Sarge." The burger had been medium rare. Elle had checked the temperature before plating, a habit she could not seem to break regardless of context. But she knew the game. She had been playing variations of this game since she was old enough to understand that some people measured their worth by diminishing others. "I apologize for the error. I'll have the kitchen prepare a new one right away." "See that you do." Briggs took a long pull from his beer. "And while you're at it, maybe bring us some of those nachos, the good ones, not the microwave garbage." "Of course, sir." She turned to leave. "Wait." Briggs held up a hand. "One more thing. Where are you from? Your accent's interesting." "San Diego, sir." "San Diego." He turned to Cross with a theatrical expression of surprise. "Did you hear that, Lieutenant? She's a local. Could have fooled me." Cross smiled the smile of a woman who believed cruelty was a form of sophistication. "Maybe she's not from the part of San Diego that speaks English as a first language." Elle's expression remained unchanged. She wrote the nacho order on her pad and returned to the kitchen, and the only sign that the exchange had registered at all was a slight tightening in her jaw that lasted less than a second and was seen by no one except Doc Ramos, who watched her go with eyes that had grown very still. The new burger was delivered. The nachos were delivered. Drake found fault with the nachos. Elle replaced them. Cross asked for a specific brand of sparkling water that Rosie's Diner had never carried in its 22 years of operation and seemed offended when informed of this fact. Jennings knocked over the salt shaker and watched Elle clean it up with the same detached amusement a child shows when toppling a tower of blocks. Through all of it, Elle maintained a composure so total that it circled past patience and into something that might, to a careful observer, have looked like discipline. Not the discipline of a person biting their tongue, but the deeper discipline of someone who had learned to absorb discomfort the way a shock absorber absorbs impact, by converting energy into stillness. Tommy Chen watched the whole thing from behind the bus station. He was 19, with the long limbs and uncertain posture of someone who had not yet finished deciding who he was going to be. He had worked at Rosie's for 8 months, saving for either college or a recruitment office, depending on which future felt more real on any given day. He admired Elle in the quiet way that younger people admire those who seem to possess a quality they cannot name but desperately want to acquire. He had never seen her lose her temper. He had never heard her complain. He had never seen her move with anything less than total control of her body and space. And this was the thing that fascinated him most, because he was at the age where control of any kind felt like a superpower. He caught her between the kitchen and the dining room. "You okay, Elle?" She looked at him with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, but simply present, as if she had decided to spend the next 3 seconds giving him her complete attention. "Been worse." His eyes drifted to her wrist, where the sleeve of her uniform had pulled back slightly. A scar ran along the inside of her forearm, pale and smooth, not the rough texture of a kitchen accident, but the precise, linear mark of a surgical incision. She caught his glance and pulled her sleeve down with a motion so practiced it was almost invisible. "Don't you have tables to bus?" she asked, and the question carried just enough warmth to qualify as affection. Tommy grabbed his bus tray and headed for the dining room, and Elle stood alone in the narrow corridor between the kitchen and the world, her hand resting on the wall in a way that might have been exhaustion or might have been something else entirely. The front door opened again. Colonel James Iron Jack Merritt entered Rosie's diner the way a cathedral enters a skyline, not by demanding attention, but by being impossible to ignore. He was 56 years old, with the broad shoulders and squared-off frame of a man who had been built for load-bearing in every sense of the word. His silver hair was cropped close, his civilian clothes were pressed with a crease sharp enough to slice paper, and he walked with a barely perceptible limp in his left leg, the kind of imperfection that a man of his bearing would have trained himself to conceal from everyone except his physical therapist and the mirror. The effect on the Marines was immediate and involuntary. Briggs stood so fast his knee hit the table, rattling glasses. "Sir," Drake straightened. Cross put her phone down. Jennings attempted to stand and salute simultaneously, managing neither with particular grace. Even Harlan at the counter turned his head, registering the rank and bearing of the man who had just walked in, though his reaction was limited to a slow nod of professional acknowledgement. Merritt waved them down with the same economical gesture that Harlan had used. But where Harlan's hand motion said, "Sit down," Merritt said, "I am aware of your existence and have chosen not to require anything of you at this time." It was a subtle distinction, but the Marines felt it the way fish feel changes in water pressure. He chose the booth by the window, positioning himself with a clear view of the parking lot and the road beyond. When Elle approached to take his order, his eyes swept over her with the reflexive assessment of a man who had spent 30 years evaluating human beings under pressure. He saw a small woman in a diner uniform. He saw nothing that alarmed him. He ordered black coffee and the meatloaf special and returned his attention to the window. But as Elle wrote his order, she noticed something. His left hand trembled slightly as it held the menu, not the tremor of age or nervousness, but the irregular quiver of a cardiovascular system under stress. A thin sheen of perspiration had appeared along his hairline despite the fact that the diner's air conditioning was working for once. He loosened his collar with a gesture that he probably thought was casual, but that Elle recognized as the instinctive response of a body trying to give its heart more room to work. She wrote the order and walked away, but her eyes returned to him twice before she reached the kitchen. Becky Lawson, seated in the adjacent booth, was already watching the Marines with the particular disapproval of a woman who had spent enough years in healthcare to have developed a finely calibrated intolerance for unnecessary cruelty. She was 45, a retired nurse who came to Rosie's every Friday for the meatloaf and the satisfaction of being surrounded by people whose problems she was no longer professionally obligated to solve. She had watched Briggs and his crew torment Elle for the past 40 minutes with growing irritation, and now she spoke. These boys think putting on a uniform automatically makes them heroes. She said it to no one in particular, at a volume calibrated to reach exactly the ears she intended. Briggs turned. His eyes found Becky with the predatory focus of a man unaccustomed to being challenged by civilians. "Excuse me?" Becky held his gaze with the serene indifference of a woman who had once stared down a surgeon mid-tantrum in an operating room without blinking. "I said what I said." For a moment the air between them solidified. Then Briggs turned back to his booth with a dismissive shake of his head. "Civilians," he muttered, and his table laughed. Gunnery Sergeant Ray Wallace, seated alone at a two-top near the jukebox, did not laugh. He was 35, quiet, competent, and possessed of the kind of moral compass that pointed true north even when the magnetic field of group dynamics tried to pull it off course. He had served under Briggs for 6 months and respected his tactical competence while privately questioning his character. He watched Elle clear the plates from a nearby table, noting the economy of her movements, the way she never made a wasted motion, never carried more or less than the optimal load. "She's too calm," he murmured to himself, not realizing he had spoken aloud until Elle paused in her transit and glanced at him. Their eyes met for less than a second, but in that second, Wallace felt something shift in his understanding of the room, as if he had been looking at a puzzle with a missing piece and had just noticed the outline of where it should go. Elle continued on her way, and the moment dissolved. Jennings cut his hand on a steak knife. It was a shallow wound, the kind that bleeds freely and dramatically without causing any real damage, and Jennings reacted with the theatrical alarm of someone who had confused discomfort with crisis. He held his hand up like a flag of surrender, blood running between his fingers, while Drake fumbled for napkins and Cross recoiled from the possibility of staining her blouse. Oh man, I need a bandage. Somebody get me a..." Elle was there before the sentence ended. She did not run. She did not raise her voice. She simply materialized beside the booth with the kind of quiet velocity that suggested she had been monitoring the situation before it became a situation. "Let me see." She took Jennings's hand without asking permission, rotating it palm up under the light with the practiced grip of someone who had assessed thousands of wounds under conditions far more challenging than a well-lit diner. Her thumb found the pressure point at his wrist, compressing the radial artery with exactly enough force to slow the bleeding without causing pain. Her eyes measured the depth and angle of the cut in less than 2 seconds. "Shallow, no tendon involvement. You won't need stitches." She reached for a clean cloth napkin from the neighboring table, folded it into a narrow strip with 3 quick motions, and wrapped the wound with a tension that was neither too tight nor too loose. The entire procedure took 11 seconds. "Keep your hand elevated above your heart for the next 10 minutes. The bleeding will stop on its own." Briggs stared at her. For the first time that evening, his expression contained something other than contempt. It was confusion. The specific confusion of a man encountering competence in a context where he had assumed none existed. "Are you a doctor or a waitress?" he asked. "I'm the person who just stopped your friend's bleeding," Elle replied. She gathered the soiled napkins and walked toward the kitchen without waiting for a response. At the counter, Harlan set his coffee cup down slowly. He had watched the entire exchange with the focused attention of a man evaluating a tactical demonstration. The way she had found the pressure point without searching, the speed of the improvised dressing, the clinical detachment of her assessment. This was not the first aid training they taught in CPR certification courses at the community center. This was something else. He studied Elle's retreating figure with new eyes and felt the first stirring of a question he could not yet articulate. Doc Ramos, still nursing his meatloaf at the end of the counter, caught Harlan's expression and responded with one of his own. A subtle raising of the eyebrows, a slight tilt of the head, the universal language of old men who have seen enough to know when the young ones are starting to figure out what they should have noticed all along. "Some people tell stories with their mouths," Doc said, his voice carrying just far enough to reach Harlan and no further. "Some tell them with their scars." Harlan looked at him. Doc looked back. Neither man spoke again, and the silence between them contained more information than a filing cabinet. The next hour was a pressure cooker with the heat rising 1 degree at a time. A Marine from a different table, a staff sergeant whose name tag read Morales, and whose blood alcohol level had crossed the threshold where judgment dissolves and impulse takes over, decided that the civilian man sitting at the counter had looked at him wrong. He stood up with the ponderous momentum of a refrigerator tipping forward, crossed the dining room in 4 heavy steps, and announced his grievance by sweeping the civilian's plate off the counter and onto the floor. The civilian, a truck driver named Earl who had been minding his own business and his chicken fried steak, stood up with his fists balled. Morales leaned in, his breath a fog of whiskey and resentment. "You got something to say to me, old man?" The diner held its breath. Elle stepped between them. She did not announce herself. She did not raise her voice. She simply occupied the space between 2 men who outweighed her by a combined 300 pounds and planted herself there with a stillness that was more commanding than any shout. What happened next occurred so quickly that those who witnessed it could not agree on the details afterward, only on the result. Morales reached for her shoulder, whether to move her aside or to push her, or simply because his impaired coordination could not think of anything else to do with his hand. Elle's left hand intercepted his wrist, redirecting his momentum sideways. Her right hand found the pressure point below his elbow. His knees buckled. She guided him down into the nearest chair with a single fluid motion that looked from a distance almost like assistance rather than control. Morales sat. He blinked. He was not entirely sure how he had gone from standing to sitting without making the decision himself. "You should drink some water," Elle said. "I'll bring you a glass." She released his arm and stepped away, and the entire encounter, from initiation to resolution, had lasted fewer than 4 seconds. Wallace rose half out of his chair, his eyes wide. Harlan's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Cross, who had been reaching for her phone to film the confrontation, froze with her hand in the air as if she had forgotten what she was reaching for. Briggs let out a laugh that was trying very hard to sound dismissive and not quite succeeding. "Well, look at that. Sweetheart picked up a few tricks from the Marines she serves beer to. You learned some moves watching us train, waitress?" Elle collected Earl's scattered plate and food from the floor with the same methodical calm she brought to everything. "I watch YouTube," she said without looking at Briggs. She carried the ruined dinner into the kitchen, and behind her, the diner slowly exhaled. Wallace leaned across to Harlan. "Is she MP, undercover military police?" Harlan shook his head slowly. "MPs don't move like that." "Then what is she?" Harlan did not answer. He was looking at the chair where Morales still sat, dazed and docile, and at the exact spot on the man's arm where Elle had applied pressure. It was a nerve motor point, specifically the musculocutaneous nerve junction below the lateral epicondyle. Not a technique you found on YouTube, a technique from the Tier 1 defensive control curriculum, the kind of manual that was distributed only to operators who had been selected for programs that did not appear on any organizational chart. He picked up his phone. The diner settled into an uneasy equilibrium, the kind of calm that precedes storms, not because the atmosphere is peaceful, but because the energy is gathering. Drake, stung by having been upstaged by a waitress, waited for his moment. It came when Elle passed his booth carrying a tray of hot food destined for a family of 4 near the window. He extended his leg into the aisle, a schoolyard trip that would have worked on anyone whose spatial awareness extended only to the boundaries of their own body. Elle was not that person. She registered the obstruction a full step before reaching it, adjusted her trajectory by 6 inches, and cleared Drake's boot without breaking stride, without looking down, without acknowledging the attempt. The food on her tray did not so much as ripple, but Drake was not finished. As she returned from the family's table, empty tray under her arm, he stood abruptly and reached across the counter where the condiment station sat, pretending to grab a bottle of hot sauce. His elbow struck the gravy boat that Tommy Chen was carrying toward the kitchen, sending a splash of scalding brown liquid toward the boy's face. Elle moved. Her hand shot out and pushed Tommy sideways, interposing her own arm between the boy and the hot liquid. Gravy splashed across her forearm, searing the skin. The temperature was high enough to leave a mark that would last for days. She did not make a sound. Tommy stumbled back, unhurt, wide-eyed. Drake froze with his hands still extended, his expression cycling through surprise and something darker as he realized that his casual cruelty had found the wrong target. The Marines at the table watched. The diner watched. Harlan watched. Elle lowered her arm, examined the burn with a clinical glance, and walked to the kitchen without a word. She ran cold water over the affected area for exactly 60 seconds, assessed the burn as superficial partial thickness, applied a thin layer of petroleum jelly from the first aid kit, and covered it with a non-adherent dressing, all with the practiced detachment of a surgeon suturing in an operating theater while the building shook around her. Maria Santos appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hands white with flour, her expression dark with concern. "My girl, I saw what happened. That boy nearly burned Tommy. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Maria. It's superficial." "You're not fine. You're never fine. You just say you are." Maria stepped closer, studying Elle's face with the penetrating attention of a woman who had learned to read people the way some people read weather. "I've known you 7 months, Elle. 7 months. And I still don't know anything about you except that you show up early, leave late, and handle trouble like someone who grew up surrounded by it." Elle sealed the edge of her dressing with a strip of tape, centering it with unconscious precision. "Everyone has a life before they get here, Maria. Your life has more scars than you let on." Elle looked at her employer with an expression that was neither confirmation nor denial, but simply the acknowledgement that some truths did not require words to be understood. Then she picked up her order pad and pushed through the kitchen door back into the dining room, where the noise and the heat and the low-frequency hum of human conflict waited for her like an old acquaintance. Harlan excused himself from the counter and walked toward the restroom. His path took him within 3 feet of Elle as she bent to retrieve a dropped napkin, and at that distance, his eyes caught something that the counter's separation had concealed. Her shoes. They were black, non-slip, the kind of footwear that restaurants required and kitchen supply catalogs sold by the case. But the soles were wrong. The wear pattern was concentrated on the balls of the feet and the outer edges, the signature erosion of someone who spent years in combat boots, shifting their weight forward for stability and lateral movement. Restaurant work wore shoes flat. Military service wore them angular. He filed the observation alongside the pressure point, the wound care, the posture, and the combat speed intervention with Morales, and he felt the picture beginning to take shape even though he could not yet see what it depicted. In the restroom, Harlan took out his phone and dialed a number. The call connected on the second ring. "I need a records check," he said, his voice low and steady. "Female, approximately 30, last name Vasquez, possible military medical background. Maybe connected to a combat-designated unit. Pull everything you can, fast." He ended the call, washed his hands, and returned to his seat at the counter with the patient composure of a man who understood that answers, like ammunition, were most effective when they arrived at the right moment. The door of the diner opened again, and this time it admitted Jake Navarro, a paramedic in his mid-30s wearing the dark blue uniform of the Oceanside Fire Department Emergency Medical Services. He was broad-shouldered, competent-looking, with the easy confidence of someone whose job required him to remain calm while other people panicked. He took a stool at the counter, ordered a cheeseburger and a Coke, and exchanged a familiar nod with Doc Ramos, the kind of greeting shared by men who occupied different points on the same spectrum of emergency response. Navarro's presence registered in the consciousness of the diner the way a fire extinguisher registers on a wall. Noted, appreciated in theory, and fundamentally reassuring in a way that no one examined too closely. Briggs decided the evening required a final act. He had been drinking steadily for 2 hours, and the alcohol had not dulled his cruelty so much as refined it, burning away the pretense of humor and leaving behind something colder, something that needed an audience and a victim to feel complete. He pushed back from the booth and raised his voice. "Hey, waitress, come here." Elle approached. Her order pad was in her hand, her pen was behind her ear, and her face carried the same neutral expression she had worn all evening. The expression of a person who had decided, long ago, that showing emotion in the presence of hostility was a luxury she could not afford. "I've been thinking," Briggs said, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "You've been giving us terrible service tonight. Wrong orders, slow refills, attitude. I think you owe us an apology." The diner went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a conversation ending, but the heavy quiet of a room full of people who could feel the barometric pressure dropping. "A public apology," Cross added, her phone already raised, "so we can make sure it's sincere." "Go ahead," Drake said, grinning. "We're waiting." Jennings whistled a low, mocking note. Elle stood at the end of the booth. She looked at Briggs, then at Cross, then at Drake, then at Jennings. She examined each face with the same unhurried assessment she had given the shards of glass on the floor at the beginning of the evening, cataloging edges, measuring depth, determining which pieces were dangerous and which were simply broken. She did not apologize. She did not speak. She stood in the silence and let it expand until it filled the room, until the absence of her voice became louder than anything Briggs could have said. The silence lasted 7 seconds. In a diner, 7 seconds is an eternity. Briggs felt the equilibrium shifting. He opened his mouth to escalate, but before the words could form, a sound from the window booth interrupted him. Colonel Merritt stood up from his seat. He had intended to intervene, to put an end to the petty tyranny that had been unfolding in this restaurant all evening. He was a man who had commanded thousands and had never tolerated bullying in any form, and the treatment of this waitress had been grinding against his sense of decency for the past 2 hours. He stood, took one step toward the Marine's booth, and then his body betrayed him. His left hand went to his chest. His right hand reached for the table edge and missed. The color drained from his face so quickly it was as if someone had pulled a plug, and the sheen of sweat that had been building along his hairline broke free and rolled down his temples in twin streams. His eyes went wide with the particular surprise of a body discovering that the commands it was issuing were no longer being obeyed. He said, and the word was the last coherent sound he made. Colonel James Merritt collapsed. His knees buckled first, then his hips, and then his upper body followed in a cascading failure that sent him crashing into the side of his booth and then onto the floor of Rosie's diner, with a sound that was part impact and part the terrible looseness of a body that has lost all voluntary control. Someone screamed. Cross dropped her phone. Briggs froze in his seat, his mouth still open around whatever cruelty he had been preparing to deliver. Drake shoved back from the table. Jennings, who had never seen a cardiac emergency outside of a training video, went pale and pressed himself against the wall of the booth, as if proximity to the event might prove contagious. Chaos erupted in the way chaos always erupts in enclosed spaces, simultaneously and without coordination. A woman at a nearby table began crying. Her husband stood up and sat down and stood up again. The family of 4 pulled their children close. Morales, still dazed in his chair at the counter, looked around with the bewildered expression of a man who had missed a critical plot point. Harlan was moving. He vaulted off his stool and crossed the diner in 4 strides, dropping to a knee beside Merritt's motionless form. His fingers found the colonel's neck, searching for a carotid pulse. Nothing. No pulse, no rise and fall of the chest, no breath sounds. The skin beneath his fingers was gray and clammy, the particular grayness that meant the heart had stopped doing its job. "Call 911!" Harlan shouted. "Now!" Jennings fumbled his phone out of his pocket, his hand shaking so badly that it took him 3 attempts to unlock the screen. Tommy Chen ran for the landline behind the counter. Maria Santos pushed through the kitchen door, assessed the situation in a single sweep, and began clearing tables to create space. Navarro, the paramedic, leaped from his stool and dropped to his knees on the opposite side of Merritt's body. His hands reached for the colonel's chest, then hesitated. He looked up, and his face held the specific expression of a man confronting the gap between training and reality. "I need my kit," he said. "I don't have anything here. No monitor, no drugs, no defib. My rig is parked 3 blocks away." He looked at the door, then at Merritt, calculating the time required for a round trip versus the time available in the body beneath his hands. The math did not work. "Someone has to do CPR while I run for the gear. Does anyone have AED training?" The room was full of Marines, trained warriors, men and women who had been selected from a pool of hundreds of thousands for their physical fitness, mental toughness, and ability to perform under pressure. And in that moment, not one of them moved, not because they were cowards, but because the gap between knowing what CPR looked like in a PowerPoint presentation and performing it on a human being whose life depended on the quality of your chest compressions was a gap that most people discovered only when it was too late to practice. 2 seconds of absolute silence. And then Elle walked through it. She did not run. She did not push through the crowd. She walked with the measured, purposeful stride of a person who had arrived at a place she had been to many times before, in rooms that smelled of dust and copper and burning things, beside bodies that were broken in ways far worse than this, and had done what needed to be done because there was no one else, and because stopping was not an option she had ever been trained to consider. The crowd parted for her. Not because they recognized what she was, but because something in the way she moved made parting feel like the only reasonable response. She knelt beside Colonel Merritt. Her fingers found his carotid artery. 2 fingers, index and middle, placed with the automatic accuracy of someone who had checked 10,000 pulses in conditions where accuracy was the difference between continuing resuscitation and calling time of death. "No pulse," she said, and her voice was different. It was no longer the voice of a waitress. The softness was gone. The deference was gone. The careful modulation of volume and tone designed to make her unremarkable in a room full of remarkable people was gone. What replaced it was a voice that had been forged in places where clarity was survival and hesitation was death. A voice that expected to be obeyed not because it demanded obedience, but because the alternative was someone dying. Move this table. Get him on a hard, flat surface, now. She did not look at Briggs when she said it. She did not address anyone by name or rank. She issued the command into the room, and the room responded. Briggs grabbed the table and heaved it aside before his conscious mind had processed the instruction, his body responding to the tone of command the way a soldier's body always responds, automatically, completely, without the interference of ego or opinion. Drake and Jennings cleared the surrounding chairs. Wallace pushed through from his table to help. In 3 seconds, the space around Merritt was open, and L had repositioned his body flat on the linoleum floor with his head neutral and his airway aligned. She picked up a steak knife from the overturned table and with a single, precise cut, opened Merritt's shirt from collar to waist, exposing his chest. The blade moved in a line so straight it might have been drawn with a ruler. Then she placed her hands, heel of the left hand on the lower third of the sternum, right hand on top, fingers interlaced, shoulders directly above her hands, arms locked, and she began. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each compression was delivered with mechanical precision, the exact depth and the exact rate. Her body rocked forward and back with a rhythm that was as steady as a metronome and as relentless as a piston. The room watched, and the room counted with her, involuntarily, the way people in the presence of rhythm cannot help but synchronize. On the 15th compression, something cracked beneath her hands. A rib, fractured by the force required to physically squeeze a heart back into function through the wall of a chest cavity. The sound was quiet but unmistakable, a dry, brittle pop that made Cross cover her mouth and Jennings look away. Elle did not stop. She did not hesitate. She did not adjust her pressure. Because she knew, the way she knew the names of the bones under her hands and the distance between the chambers of the heart beneath, that rib fractures during CPR were common, expected, and irrelevant compared to the alternative. 28, 29, 30. She tilted Merritt's head back, lifted his chin, sealed her mouth over his, and delivered 2 rescue breaths with the timing and volume of a ventilator. Then she returned to compressions. You, she pointed at Navarro without looking at him. Epinephrine on your rig? Navarro nodded, already rising. Yes, and AED. Bring both. Run. Navarro ran. The glass door of Rosie's diner slammed shut behind him hard enough to rattle the photographs on the walls. You. She pointed at Tommy, who stood 3 feet away with tears running silently down his cheeks, his arms at his sides, his mouth slightly open. Timer. Start the clock from now. Tommy's hand went to his phone. He pressed the button. The numbers began to count. You. She pointed at Maria. Ice, the largest bag you have, and clean towels. Go. Maria went. Each command was a single sentence. Subject, verb, object. No qualifiers, no hesitation, no wasted syllables. It was the verbal economy of a person who had learned to communicate in environments where every second spent talking was a second not spent saving someone's life. 17, 18, 19. Harlan rose to his feet. He stood slowly as if the floor had become uncertain beneath him, and the phone in his hand vibrated with an incoming message. He looked at the screen. The color left his face in a way that had nothing to do with the medical emergency on the floor. The database results had arrived. The name and photograph staring back at him from his phone screen matched the woman kneeling on the linoleum of Rosie's diner, performing CPR on a dying colonel with the mechanical perfection of someone for whom this was not a crisis but a calling. Petty Officer First Class Alara Vasquez. Combat Medic, 2nd Marine Raider Battalion. Designation, MARSOC. Call sign, Phoenix. Service record, 3 tours. Afghanistan, Helmand Province, 2017. Syria, classified, 2018. 2019. Awards, 3 Purple Hearts, Navy Cross. Status, honorable discharge. Current assignment, classified. Harlan stared at the screen. Then he looked at the woman on the floor. Then at the screen again. The Navy Cross, the 2nd highest decoration in the United States Navy, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat. He had served 28 years and had never met a living Navy Cross recipient face to face, until now. Until this waitress, this small, quiet woman in a stained apron, kneeling on the floor of a roadside diner, pumping the chest of a man whose life depended on the strength of her hands and the precision of her training. Navarro burst through the door, medical bag in one hand, AED case in the other. He dropped to his knees beside Elle and ripped open the AED case. "Good," Elle said, without breaking the rhythm of her compressions. "Attach the pads, upper right chest below the clavicle, lower left side below the armpit." Navarro peeled the adhesive pads and placed them. His hands were steadier now, guided by the gravitational pull of someone who clearly knew what she was doing. The AED unit powered on, its robotic voice cutting through the noise of the diner. Analyzing heart rhythm, do not touch the patient. Elle pulled her hands back. The room held its breath. Shock advised, stand clear. "Clear," Elle called, her voice cutting through the diner like a blade. She looked left and right, confirming that no one was touching Merritt's body. "Delivering shock." The AED fired. Merritt's body arched off the floor and settled. The monitor displayed a flat line that rippled once, twice, and went still. "No conversion," Elle said. "Resuming CPR, epinephrine, 1 milligram IV push, now." "I don't have IV access," Navarro said. "Then we go intraosseous. Do you have a drill?" Navarro shook his head. His expression held the painful recognition of a man discovering the limits of his kit at the worst possible moment. Elle paused for exactly 1 second. She looked at the medical bag. She looked at Merritt's chest. She reached into the bag and found what she was looking for. A large bore needle, the kind used for decompression of tension pneumothorax in the field. "What are you?" Navarro began. She did not explain. She palpated Merritt's chest with her left hand, counting intercostal spaces with the speed of a pianist counting keys. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She positioned the needle at a 45-degree angle and inserted it with a single controlled push. It was a procedure that did not exist in any civilian first aid manual. It was not taught in paramedic school. It was not available as a YouTube tutorial. It was a combat medic field procedure designed for forward operating bases and ambush sites and helicopter medevacs, the kind of intervention that was practiced on cadavers and performed on comrades and never, ever attempted by someone who had not been trained to do it under fire. In the moment of the needle's insertion, Elle's right sleeve, already loosened by the violence of the CPR compressions, slid above her elbow, and the tattoo was visible. It covered the inside of her right forearm, from wrist to mid-bicep, a caduceus, the twin serpent staff of medicine, intertwined with the skull and crossbones insignia of the Marine Raiders. Below it, rendered in faded black ink that had been exposed to sun and sand and sweat and things far worse, were the letters MARSOC and the designation 2-17, 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, 2017. 3 seconds of absolute silence. Harlan saw it first. The tattoo confirmed what his phone had already told him, but seeing it on her skin, seeing the physical evidence of a service record that most Marines would never comprehend, transformed knowledge into reality in a way that no database search ever could. He straightened, spine rigid, shoulders back, chin level, feet together at a 45-degree angle. His right hand came up to his brow in a salute, full military bearing, the kind rendered not to a superior officer, but to a warrior who had earned something that transcended rank. He saluted a waitress, in a diner, and he held it. Briggs turned. He saw the master gunnery sergeant, a man with 28 years of unblemished service and a reputation for never bending to sentiment, standing at attention and saluting the woman who had been serving him beer all night. His mouth opened. No sound came out. His face went the color of old concrete, and his hand, driven by 20 years of conditioned reflex, began to rise toward his forehead before his conscious mind could intervene. Cross dropped her phone. It hit the floor screen down, the recording still running, capturing nothing but the underside of a table and the sound of history rearranging itself. Drake sank into his chair. His hands went to his head, fingers threading through his hair, pulling, as if the physical sensation might anchor him to a version of reality that was rapidly dissolving beneath him. Jennings stood at attention. His body made the decision before his brain caught up, snapping upright with the autonomic precision of a man whose training overrode his confusion. His mouth moved, producing sounds that wanted to be words but could not quite organize themselves into coherent speech. Ma'am, Wallace rose from his table, nodding slowly, the way a man nods when a suspicion he has carried all evening is finally confirmed. "I knew something was off," he murmured. "I knew it." Doc Ramos, at the end of the counter, lifted his coffee cup. There was no surprise on his face. There had never been any surprise on his face. He had known from the first night Elle walked into Rosie's diner 7 months ago, had recognized in her posture and her silence and her wounds the particular signature of a warrior who had laid down their weapons but had not yet laid down their war. He drank his coffee and said nothing, and the smile that touched the corner of his mouth was the smile of a man who had been waiting for this moment with the patience of a father watching his child finally be seen. Tommy stood 3 feet from Elle, his phone still counting. The numbers blurred through the tears that he did not bother to wipe. 4 minutes, 20 seconds, he whispered. Maria Santos pressed both hands against her chest, her body shaking with the kind of silent weeping that comes when you discover that the person you have been trying to protect has been, all along, the one protecting everyone else. Becky Lawson stood. She placed her hand over her heart, not a salute but a gesture of pure civilian respect, and she held it there. At the far booth, a man in his 60s, a veteran whose war had been Vietnam and whose silence about it had lasted 40 years, rose to his feet. Then the man beside him rose. Then a woman at the counter, whose father had died at Quai San, whose son served at Camp Lejeune. They stood one by one, not because anyone told them to, but because standing felt like the only appropriate response to what they were witnessing. The diner's ambient noise, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic on Pacific Coast Highway, all of it receded until there was nothing left but the sound of Elle counting compressions and the collective held breath of 23 people who had just discovered that the most remarkable person in the room was the one they had spent all evening ignoring. Elle did not look up. She did not acknowledge the salute, the standing, the tears, the silence. She continued to pump Merritt's chest with the same mechanical precision she had maintained from the first compression, because the man beneath her hands was not yet breathing, and the gap between alive and dead was measured in seconds, not gestures. "Recharging," the AED announced. "Stand clear." "Clear," Elle ordered. She pulled her hands back. "Second shock." The AED fired. Merritt's body arched. The monitor traced a line that stuttered, peaked, stuttered again, and then, with the reluctant regularity of an engine catching after a long, cold night, began to beat. Beep, beep, beep. A pulse. Elle kept her fingers on his carotid for 5 seconds, counting the beats, verifying the rhythm. Then she sat back on her heels, closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, the way a diver surfaces and takes that first breath, not with relief but with the simple acknowledgement that oxygen is necessary and has been earned. Then her eyes opened and she was back. Maintain position. Keep him on his side. Do not let him sit up. Monitor his breathing until EMS arrives. She issued the instructions to Navarro, who obeyed them without question, because in the hierarchy of competence that had established itself in the last 4 minutes, there was no ambiguity about who was in command. Harlan lowered his salute. He took 1 step toward Elle, then stopped, because the phone in his pocket buzzed again, and the information on the screen completed the picture that had been assembling itself all evening. He read the screen. Then he read it again. Then he looked at Merritt, unconscious but breathing on the floor, and at the woman who had just saved his life for the second time. And his voice, when it came, was thick with something that a 28-year career of military stoicism had not prepared him to process. "Petty Officer First Class Alara Vasquez," he said, loud enough for the diner to hear, his voice cracking on the rank like a window cracking under sudden temperature change. "Combat Medic, 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, call sign Phoenix." Each word fell into the silence like a stone into deep water, sending ripples that touched every person in the room. 3 tours of duty, Afghanistan, Syria, classified operations, 3 Purple Hearts. Briggs made a sound in the back of his throat. It was the sound of a man watching the ground open beneath his feet. 1 Navy Cross. The words hung in the air of Rosie's diner, surrounded by faded photographs and the smell of coffee and the residual ozone of an AED discharge, and they changed everything. The Navy Cross, the 2nd highest decoration for valor in the United States military, awarded to fewer service members in any given year than could fill a single booth in a roadside restaurant. For heroism in combat that went beyond the call of duty, beyond the reasonable expectation of survival, beyond the limits of what the human body and spirit were designed to endure. A waitress, serving beer, taking orders, cleaning up broken glass with her bare hands. Briggs's whisper was barely audible, and the words came out broken, each syllable a small piece of the world he had constructed for himself crumbling away. Navy Cross. She has a Navy Cross. Wallace, standing behind the booth, spoke in a measured voice for those who did not understand the weight of what they were hearing. It is the second highest military decoration that can be awarded to a member of the United States Navy, Marine Corps, or Coast Guard. It is given for extraordinary heroism in combat. In the entire history of the Marine Corps, fewer than 1,000 have ever been awarded. The number settled over the room like gravity. Doc Ramos set his coffee cup down. When he spoke, his voice carried the rough texture of a man who had kept a secret for 7 months and was now, finally, laying it on the counter beside his cold meatloaf. "I served with her father," he said. "Ramadi, 2004. Gunnery Sergeant Victor Vasquez. Toughest man I ever knew. He was killed in Fallujah in 2006. His eyes found Elle, still kneeling on the floor, still monitoring Merritt's pulse with 2 fingers on his neck. She grew up in the barracks, enlisted the day she turned 18, became the finest combat medic that MARSOC ever produced. The last sentence carried the weight of testimony, not opinion, not praise, testimony, the sworn statement of a man who had been there and who was telling the truth because the truth was all he had left to give. Elle did not react to her biography being read aloud in a restaurant. She adjusted Merritt's head position, checked his pupil response by lifting one eyelid with her thumb, and monitored the AED readout with the focused attention of someone for whom the patient in front of her was the only person in the room. The ambulance sirens grew louder, cutting through the night outside Rosie's diner, and for the first time in 4.5 minutes, the world outside the building began to reassert its existence. The paramedic team pushed through the front door. 2 men and a woman in blue, loaded with cases and monitors and the professional urgency of people whose entire career consisted of arriving after the worst had already happened. The team leader, a man in his 40s with a shaved head and the dense, scarred hands of someone who had spent his life reaching into wreckage, stopped 3 feet from Merritt's body and surveyed the scene. Needle decompression, correctly placed. CPR in progress with proper form. AED deployed. 2 shocks delivered. Conversion achieved. Patient in recovery position with stable vitals. Someone had done everything right. Someone had done everything exactly the way it was supposed to be done, in the exact order, at the exact speed, with the exact level of skill. He turned to Navarro. "Who did this?" Navarro pointed to Elle. The team leader looked at her. He looked at her stained apron and her waitress uniform and the burn mark on her forearm and the tattoo on her inner arm. And his expression underwent the same transformation that had rippled through the diner, the specific recalibration of a man's understanding of who was standing in front of him. He was former Navy himself, a corpsman. Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class, Fallujah, 2005. He knew the insignia. He knew what it meant. He saluted. "Outstanding work, Doc." In the military, Doc was not a name. It was a title. The title given to combat medics by the Marines and sailors who depended on them to keep them alive in places where staying alive was an accomplishment measured in hours. To call someone Doc was to acknowledge them as the person who stood between you and the end of everything, the person who would crawl through fire and press their hands into your wounds and refuse to let your body quit, even when your body had decided that quitting was the only reasonable option. He called a waitress Doc, and every military person in the room understood exactly what he meant. Merritt's eyes opened. They opened slowly, the way eyes open after a long unconsciousness, struggling to reconcile the information flooding in with the last coherent memory available. Fluorescent lights. A ceiling made of water-stained acoustic tiles. Faces above him, inverted, blurred. The weight of hands on his body, checking, monitoring, maintaining. His gaze found Elle. She was still kneeling beside him, her fingers on his wrist now, counting pulse beats with the same concentration she had brought to every task all evening, from clearing broken glass to delivering electric shocks to a dying man's heart. The tattoo on her forearm was visible, and Merritt stared at it with the particular intensity of a man whose brain was processing old information through the lens of new circumstances. His lips moved. The sound that emerged was barely a whisper, scraped raw by the tube that had been breathing for him, and the compressions that had fractured his ribs. But in the silence of the diner, every ear caught it. Phoenix. One word, a call sign. A name that existed in classified reports and debriefing transcripts and the memories of men who had been pulled from the dust and the fire by hands that refused to stop working. Helmond, he whispered. You're the girl from Helmond. Elle looked at him. For the first time all evening, her composure showed a fracture, not a break, but a hairline crack, a thinning of the armor she had worn so perfectly for so long. She held his gaze, and in the space between their eyes was a bridge that stretched back 7 years, across deserts and operating tables and helicopter rotors and the sound of men screaming and a woman's hands, these hands, working in the dark. She nodded, one nod, slow and deliberate, carrying the weight of everything she had not said all evening and everything she would never say. Merritt's eyes filled. His hand, trembling with the weakness of a body that had died and been brought back, reached toward her. You saved me twice, he said. The words broke open something in the room that could not be put back together. 23 people in a roadside diner on a Friday night in Oceanside, California, stood witness to a moment that most of them would remember for the rest of their lives. A dying colonel recognizing the waitress who had pulled him from the rubble of a battlefield 7 years ago, and had now, in a restaurant that smelled of coffee and fryer grease, pulled him back from the dead a second time. Elle placed her hand over his. Gently. The way you hold something precious that does not belong to you. Rest now, Colonel. The ambulance is here. The paramedic team lifted Merritt onto the stretcher with the practiced coordination of people who carried the weight of others for a living. As they wheeled him toward the door, Merritt's hand reached out and caught Elle's wrist. His grip was weak, but his eyes were clear. Don't disappear again, Phoenix. Not this time. Elle said nothing. She watched them carry him through the glass door and into the flashing red lights of the ambulance, and her hand remained at her side, still warm from the contact, still carrying the pulse of a man she had refused to let die. The ambulance pulled away. The sirens faded into the distance, absorbed by the California night, and Rosie's diner, with its faded flag and its photographs and its cracked linoleum floor, still marked with the outline of a body that had been dead for 4 minutes and 12 seconds, stood in the silence that follows the departure of something sacred. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator, the distant crash of waves on the oceanside shore, and the quiet, steady breathing of a woman named Alara Vasquez, who stood alone in the center of the room, her apron stained with coffee and grease and the invisible residue of a life she had tried to leave behind. Then Briggs moved. He stepped out of the booth and walked toward Elle with the unsteady gait of a man whose understanding of the world had been disassembled and not yet reassembled. He stopped 3 feet from her. His jaw worked, searching for words that his vocabulary had never needed to contain. And then Sergeant First Class Tanner Briggs, who had spent the entire evening treating this woman as something less than human, dropped to one knee. Not because anyone ordered him to, not because military protocol required it. He knelt because his legs could no longer support the weight of what he now understood he had done, and because kneeling was the only gesture his body could find that came close to expressing the magnitude of the error he had committed. Ma'am, I don't have words. Elle looked down at him. There was no anger in her expression, no vindication, no triumph. There was something infinitely more unsettling, understanding. The understanding of a person who had been underestimated so many times that the experience had ceased to wound and had become, instead, a kind of armor. Stand up, Sergeant, she said. Marines don't kneel. The words were quiet, but they carried across the room with the clarity of a bell, and they accomplished something that hours of confrontation had failed to achieve. They gave Briggs permission to be better than the person he had been 5 minutes ago. He stood. His eyes were red. His hands hung at his sides, and for the first time all evening, they were completely still. Cross stepped forward next. She held up her phone, showing the screen to Elle, and pressed delete on the video she had been recording. The confirmation dialogue appeared, and she tapped yes with a finger that trembled. I'm sorry, she said. It was 2 words, and they were the most honest thing she had said all night. Drake approached. He could not look Elle in the eye, so he looked at the floor, at the spot where Merritt had fallen, at the evidence of what had happened and what it meant. The hot sauce, he said, when I knocked it toward the kid. Tommy, I'm sorry. That was... He searched for the word. Wrong. That was wrong. Elle regarded him with the same level assessment she had given every challenge all evening. The boy wasn't hurt, but if the burn had been worse, you and I would be having a different conversation right now." Drake nodded. He understood. The waitress who had been absorbing his cruelty for 2 hours was the same woman who could have ended him with a pressure point and a pivot. And the fact that she had chosen restraint over retaliation was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of the kind of strength he had not yet learned to recognize. Jennings stood at rigid attention, his salute wavering with the unsteadiness of genuine emotion rather than practiced form. He did not speak. He did not need to. The tears running down his cheeks said everything that words could not. The diner began to breathe again, slowly, the way a room breathes after a storm passes through and leaves everything rearranged. People sat down. Conversations resumed in whispers. Maria Santos brought fresh coffee to the counter, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. Tommy Chen cleared tables with a reverence that transformed the mundane act of stacking plates into something close to ceremony. Harlan approached Elle as the immediate aftermath subsided. He sat on the stool beside where she stood, positioning himself at her level rather than standing above her, and when he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "Why are you here? With a Navy Cross, you could be anywhere. Training, command, advisory. You could write your own ticket to any assignment in the Corps." Elle looked at him, and for the first time all evening, the armor thinned enough to let something through. Not vulnerability exactly, but the acknowledgement that behind the composure and the precision and the silence, there was a human being who carried wounds that no medical kit could dress. "I lost my team in Helmand, Master Guns. 11 people I pulled out alive. 3 I couldn't save." She paused. The pause was not for dramatic effect. It was the pause of a person navigating around memories that were still sharp enough to cut. "I needed time." Harlan nodded. He understood the language she was speaking, the compressed vocabulary of grief that soldiers used when the full version was too heavy to carry in conversation. "I understand," was all he said, and the 2 words contained more than a paragraph ever could. Cross stepped forward next. She did not approach with the theatrical contrition of someone performing an apology for an audience. She approached the way a person approaches the edge of a cliff they have been walking toward for a long time without realizing it. One careful step at a time, eyes fixed on the drop. "I filmed you," she said. Her voice was stripped of the polish that had coated it all evening. "I filmed you being humiliated, and I was going to post it. I was going to make you a punchline for people who would never know your name." She stopped. Her throat worked around the next sentence. "What kind of officer does that make me?" The question was not rhetorical. She was genuinely asking, and the fact that she was asking a waitress in a diner rather than a superior in a briefing room said everything about how thoroughly the last 5 minutes had rearranged her understanding of where authority resided. Wallace answered from behind her, his voice measured and deliberate. "The kind who still has a chance to change, Lieutenant." Cross turned to look at him, and whatever she saw in his expression was enough to make her nod once and step back without another word. She pocketed her phone, and for the rest of the evening, it stayed there. The diner settled into the strange, fragile equilibrium that follows upheaval. The fluorescent lights buzzed their constant drone. The coffee machine gurgled in the kitchen. Outside, the Pacific Coast Highway carried its endless river of headlights north and south, indifferent to the fact that something irreversible had occurred inside a small rectangle of linoleum and vinyl 20 feet from its shoulder. The world continued, as the world always does, but the people inside Rosie's diner had been subtly and permanently altered, the way a landscape is altered after a wildfire passes through, still recognizable but fundamentally changed in composition. Harlan excused himself from the counter and stepped outside into the parking lot, where the salt air coming off the ocean carried the distant smell of kelp and diesel. He leaned against the brick wall of the diner and made a phone call. The connection took 3 rings, which was 2 more than he expected from a commanding officer's direct line at Camp Pendleton on a Friday night. "Colonel Reeves, this is Master Gunnery Sergeant Harlan, 3rd Battalion. "Harlan, it's 22:30 on a Friday. This better be worth the interruption." "Sir, I'm at a civilian establishment in Oceanside. There's been a medical incident. Colonel Merritt suffered cardiac arrest." A pause, the rustle of someone sitting up straighter. "Merritt, is he alive?" "Affirmative, sir. He was resuscitated on scene by a civilian bystander. or rather, by someone presenting as a civilian bystander. Harlan paused, choosing his next words with the precision of a man loading a weapon. The individual who performed the resuscitation is Petty Officer First Class Ilara Vasquez, Combat Medic, 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, call sign Phoenix. The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 seconds. In military communication, 4 seconds of silence was an earthquake. Vasquez? Reeves repeated. Phoenix, she's in Oceanside? Affirmative. She's been working as a waitress at a local diner for approximately 7 months. Another silence. This one lasted longer. When Reeves spoke again, his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with rank. We've been looking for her for 2 years, Harlan. Medical Corps has been requesting her for a training instructor position since her discharge. She dropped off the grid, no forwarding address, no contact information, nothing. Every inquiry came back empty. She didn't want to be found, sir. Clearly. A breath. The sound of a man recalibrating his response from professional to personal and back again. Is she all right? Harlan looked through the window of the diner, where Elle stood behind the counter, wiping down surfaces with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, as if the act of cleaning could restore order to a world that had just been turned inside out. She's working, sir. That's all I can tell you. Keep me informed. I'll make some calls in the morning. And Harlan, the incident tonight with Merritt, I want a full report. But I also want your assessment of her, professional and personal. Understood? Understood, sir. Harlan ended the call and stood for a moment in the parking lot, looking up at the California sky where the stars competed with the ambient glow of the Marine base 5 miles to the north. Somewhere on that base, in a filing cabinet inside a building that did not appear on any public map, there was a folder with Elle's name on it. Inside that folder were citations and commendations and medical records and mission reports that told the story of a woman who had gone into places where the human body was not designed to survive and had brought people back alive. The folder did not mention roadside diners or coffee stains or the particular loneliness of a warrior who had chosen to disappear. He went back inside. The diner was emptying. Families had gathered their children and slipped out quietly, as if the building had become a place where loud departures felt inappropriate. The Marines from other tables had filed out in 1s and 2s, several of them pausing at the counter to leave tips that were 3 and 4 times the cost of their meals, folded under coffee cups with the careful placement of people making an offering rather than a payment. Becky Lawson remained in her booth. She watched Elle move through the diner with the practiced eye of a woman who had spent 20 years monitoring vital signs and recognized exhaustion when she saw it. Not the exhaustion of a long shift, but the deeper fatigue of a person who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had just been forced to set it down in public. She caught Elle's arm as she passed. I was a nurse for 20 years, Becky said. Emergency department, trauma center, intensive care. I have seen a lot of people try to save a lot of lives. She held Elle's gaze. I have never seen anyone perform a needle decompression with bare hands in a restaurant and make it look routine. Elle's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. The battlefield doesn't come with equipment catalogs. Becky squeezed her arm once and let go, and the contact lasted just long enough to communicate everything that the words left unsaid. Tommy Chen found Elle in the kitchen. She was restocking the first aid kit, replacing the supplies she had used with items from the backup inventory that Maria kept on the top shelf, and the care with which she organized the remaining materials, antiseptic wipes sorted by size, gauze packets arranged by sterility rating, suggested that this was not a chore, but a ritual, the kind of repetitive precision that kept certain kinds of minds from spiraling into the spaces between tasks. He stood in the doorway, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his bus tray balanced on one hip. He had been constructing the sentence in his head for 20 minutes, turning the words over, testing their weight, and he still was not sure they were ready. But the evening had taught him that waiting for the perfect moment was a luxury that life did not always provide. Elle, can I ask you something? She did not stop what she was doing, but her attention shifted to him in a way that he could feel even without seeing her eyes. Go ahead. I've been thinking about enlisting, Marine Corps. I've been thinking about it for a while. My dad wants me to go to college. My mom doesn't want me to go anywhere. He paused. You think I should do it? Elle closed the first aid kit. She turned to face him, and the look she gave him was neither encouraging nor discouraging. It was the look of someone measuring the distance between a question and its consequences. Don't enlist for glory, she said. Don't enlist because you saw something tonight that looked heroic. What happened out there wasn't heroism. It was training meeting necessity, that's all. She paused. If you want to serve, serve because you're ready to do the things nobody sees, for people who will never know your name. If that sounds like enough for you, then you'll do fine. If it doesn't, there's no shame in finding a different path. Tommy nodded slowly, absorbing the words with the earnest concentration of someone who understood he had just been given something more valuable than advice. He had been given a framework, a way of evaluating a decision that would define the trajectory of his life, delivered by someone who had lived inside that decision and emerged carrying its full weight. Thanks, Elle. Go bust your tables, Tommy. He went. And behind him, Elle stood alone in the kitchen, her hand resting on the closed first aid kit, her eyes focused on something that was not in the room. If this story of hidden warriors and quiet courage is touching your heart right now, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. The ending of this story will stay with you long after the video is over. Trust me, you want to see what happens next. And make sure you're subscribed with the bell on, because stories like this one are why this channel exists. Now, let's find out what happens after the diner closes its doors. The last customers left around 11. Maria Santos locked the front door with the deliberate finality of a woman closing a chapter in a book she would be reading for the rest of her life. She turned from the door and surveyed her diner, taking in the overturned condiment bottles that nobody had righted, the coffee rings on the counter that nobody had wiped, the spot on the floor where Colonel Merritt had died and been reborn, still faintly discolored despite 3 rounds of mopping. She walked to the wall behind the register where the photographs hung. Decades of faces stared back at her. Young men in pressed uniforms, older men in baseball caps, families posed in front of flags and front porches, and the flat brown landscapes of places whose names they had learned to pronounce but never learned to forget. Her husband's photograph occupied the center of the arrangement, a staff sergeant with laughing eyes and a jawline that their youngest son had inherited, along with his stubbornness. Maria took down an empty frame that had hung beside her husband's photo for years, waiting for an occupant. She reached into the register drawer and pulled out a newspaper clipping she had cut that morning from the Camp Pendleton Scout, a small article about the Marine Raider insignia and its history. She placed the clipping in the frame, and below it, in the careful handwriting of a woman who wrote letters to her dead husband every Sunday, she added a single line on a strip of masking tape. Heroes don't need uniforms. She hung the frame and stepped back. It was not much, a newspaper clipping and a strip of tape. But in the ecology of Rosie's diner, where the walls were the memory and the photographs were the proof, it was a declaration. A permanent marker that said something happened here, and we will not pretend it didn't. Doc Ramos was the last to leave, and he did not leave empty-handed. He waited until the diner was quiet, until Maria had retreated to the kitchen and Tommy had gone home, and the only person remaining was Elle, wiping down the counter with the mechanical thoroughness of someone who cleaned the way other people meditated, finding order in repetition, finding silence in surfaces that reflected nothing back. He reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and withdrew something small. He placed it on the counter in front of Elle's path with the careful deliberation of a man setting down a chess piece that would determine the outcome of the game. It was a challenge coin, brass, scratched, and worn smooth along the edges by years of being carried in a pocket and rubbed between anxious fingers during long nights in foreign places. On one side, the Marine Corps emblem. On the other, an engraving. Gestit Victor Vasquez, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, Ramadi. Elle's hand stopped mid-wipe. She stared at the coin the way a person stares at a voice they have not heard in years, recognizing it before the conscious mind can assign it a name. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "He gave it to me," Doc said. "Ramadi, the night before the convoy. He said if anything happened to him, he wanted someone to make sure his little girl got it." He paused. The pause contained 20 years of carrying a dead man's last request in a shirt pocket. "He always said you'd be a better Marine than he ever was." Elle picked up the coin. She held it in her palm, and the weight of it, a few ounces of brass and memory, settled into her hand the way a key settles into a lock. For the first time that evening, for the first time in 7 months, for the first time since a night in Helmand province when the sky had been full of tracers and the air had been full of screaming and she had worked until her hands were numb and her vision blurred and 3 of the people she was trying to save had stopped being people and become bodies. Alara Vasquez's eyes filled with tears. She did not wipe them. She did not look away. She stood behind the counter of Rosie's diner and let them fall, 2 silent lines tracing paths down cheeks that had been dry for so long the skin had forgotten what moisture felt like. Doc Ramos watched her cry the way a medic watches a wound finally drain, with relief, with the understanding that some things needed to come out before healing could begin. Your father would be proud of you, Elle, not for what you did tonight, for all of it, for surviving, for keeping going when keeping going was the hardest thing a person could do. Elle closed her fingers around the coin. She looked at Doc, and the tears on her face did not diminish her. They completed her. They were the missing piece that the armor had been designed to conceal, the evidence that behind the precision and the silence and the inexhaustible competence was a woman who felt everything and had simply chosen to carry it rather than display it. Thank you, Doc. He touched the brim of his cap, the gesture of a man whose generation expressed affection through formality, and walked out into the night. The bell above the door chimed once, and then the diner was empty, except for Elle and the ghosts of the evening and a brass coin that carried the warmth of a father's hand across 20 years of absence. Harlan drove her home. He did not ask permission. He simply waited by his truck in the parking lot until Elle locked the back door and walked out. And when she saw him, she did not argue. Some gestures were beyond the territory of pride, and accepting a ride from a man who had saluted you in a restaurant was one of them. The drive was short. Elle's apartment was located behind a strip mall on Mission Avenue, a second-floor unit accessible by an exterior staircase that creaked with each step. The building was unremarkable in every way that a building can be unremarkable. Beige stucco, brown trim, a courtyard with a dead palm tree, and a vending machine that had been broken since the previous tenant's occupancy. Elle thanked Harlan and climbed the stairs. He watched her go, waiting until the light in her window came on before pulling away. He did not see what was inside the apartment. If he had, the questions that had been assembling in his mind all evening would have multiplied beyond his capacity to contain them, because the apartment of Alara Vasquez did not look like the apartment of a waitress. The living room contained a desk, and on that desk was a map. Not a tourist map or a city planning document, but a tactical overlay of the region surrounding Camp Pendleton, annotated with symbols and notations that belonged in a command post rather than a studio apartment. Pinned to the wall above the desk were photographs, some taken from considerable distance with a telephoto lens, showing vehicles entering and leaving the base through the secondary gate. One photograph showed Colonel Merritt walking across a parking lot, his face circled in blue marker. Another showed a man Elle did not recognize, his face circled in red. Beside the map, a laptop sat closed. Its casing bore no logos, no stickers, no identifying marks. The encryption software loaded on its hard drive was the kind issued by agencies whose names appeared in budget documents but not in phone directories. Elle set the challenge coin on the desk beside the laptop. She removed her apron, folded it with the automatic precision that governed all her movements, and placed it on the chair. Then she opened the laptop and logged into a communications channel that required 3 separate authentication protocols to access. A message was waiting. Phoenix. Status update on principal. She typed her response with fingers that still carried the faint soreness of 40 minutes of chest compressions. Principal secured, cardiac event neutralized on site, transported to Tri-City Medical. Cover identity compromised, requesting guidance. The response came within 90 seconds. Acknowledged. Threat assessment on principal remains elevated. Maintain proximity. Operation Guardian Angel continues. Cover adjustment authorized at your discretion. Elle read the message twice. Operation Guardian Angel. The designation given to her assignment 14 months ago, when intelligence intercepts had revealed a credible threat against Colonel Merritt connected to his role in a classified counterterrorism operation that had dismantled a network spanning 3 continents. The assignment was simple in description and complex in execution. Embed in proximity to the principal. Monitor, protect, report. Do not reveal identity unless the principal's life is in imminent danger. Tonight, his life had been in imminent danger. Not from the threat she had been deployed to counter, but but from the fragility of the human heart, which followed no operational timeline and obeyed no intelligence briefing. She closed the laptop and sat in the silence of her apartment, listening to the hum of the vending machine through the floor and the distant rhythm of the ocean beyond the strip mall and the highway and the cliffs. The challenge coin sat on the desk, catching the light from the street lamp outside her window. She picked it up and turned it between her fingers, the brass warm against her skin, and for a moment, she was 8 years old again, standing in a barracks hallway in Camp Lejeune, wearing a camouflage jacket 4 sizes too large that smelled of her father's aftershave and gun oil, watching him walk toward the transport that would carry him to a place whose name she could not pronounce and from which he would not return. She set the coin down. She stood. She crossed to the window and looked out at the darkness that lay between her apartment and the base, the 5 miles of California coast that separated the woman she was pretending to be from the woman she had been trained to become. The next morning, the hospital confirmed what Elle already knew. Colonel Merritt was stable. The attending cardiologist briefed the family and the military liaison with the particular blend of clinical precision and barely concealed astonishment that doctors reserve for cases that should have ended differently. The cardiac arrest had been caused by a sudden occlusion of the left anterior descending artery. Without intervention, death would have occurred within 6 minutes. Intervention had begun within 90 seconds and had been, in the cardiologist's professional opinion, flawless. Whoever performed the resuscitation knew exactly what they were doing, the doctor told the liaison officer. The CPR was textbook. The needle decompression was a judgment call that most emergency physicians would hesitate to make outside a hospital setting, and it was executed perfectly. If the delay had been even another minute and a half, we would be having a very different conversation. The liaison officer, a major who had seen the preliminary report from Harlan, said nothing. He already knew who had performed the resuscitation. The information had traveled up the chain of command with the velocity that classified personnel files achieved when they intersected with high-ranking casualties, which was to say, very fast indeed. Merritt called Elle that afternoon. Harlan had provided the number, and the colonel's voice, weakened by the ventilator and the sedation and the particular exhaustion of a body that had been dead and brought back, came through the phone like a transmission from a distant station. Phoenix. Elle stood in her apartment, the phone pressed to her ear, the challenge coin in her other hand. She did not speak immediately. She listened to the sound of his breathing, to the beep of the cardiac monitor in the background, to the ambient noise of a hospital room where a man who should have died was instead making phone calls. Colonel, I owe you 2 lives. I'm not sure the military has a form for that. You don't owe me anything, sir. It's what I was trained to do. No, it's what you chose to do. Training gives you the capability. The choice is something else entirely. A pause. The pause of a man who had been a commander long enough to know how to frame a proposition. I've been in contact with Camp Lejeune. The Combat Medic Training Battalion is standing up a new advanced program, field trauma, austere environment medicine, the kind of curriculum that doesn't exist in any manual because the people who know how to teach it are either still deployed or, he trailed off, or they've disappeared into civilian life and are serving meatloaf in California. Elle said nothing. I want you to lead it, not because I owe you and not because the Navy Cross makes you qualified, although it does. Because I watched you operate tonight, Phoenix, in a diner, with a first aid kit and a steak knife, and a paramedic who was out of his depth, and you saved my life the same way you saved it in Helmand, not with equipment, with certainty. That's what those students need, not techniques, certainty. Elle looked at the map on her wall, at the photographs, at the laptop with its encrypted channel and its standing orders, at the challenge coin that carried her father's name across 2 decades of silence. I'll think about it, Colonel. Don't think too long. The world has a way of making decisions for people who take too long to make them for themselves. The line went quiet. Elle set the phone down and stood in the center of her apartment, surrounded by the artifacts of 2 identities that could not coexist indefinitely, the waitress and the warrior, the civilian and the ghost, the woman who poured coffee and the woman who held hearts in her hands and refused to let them stop beating. The following Friday, Elle tied her apron and walked into Rosie's diner at 4 p.m, the same time she had walked in every day for 7 months. The routine was identical. The coffee was brewed. The tables were set. The specials were written on the chalkboard in Maria's careful hand. Everything was the same. Everything was different. The first Marines arrived at 5:30, a group of 4 from Camp Pendleton who had never been to Rosie's before, but had heard about the diner from someone who had heard about it from someone who had been there that night. They took a booth near the window and ordered burgers and coffee, and when Elle approached to take their order, the corporal at the head of the table straightened in his seat and said, "Ma'am." Not sweetheart, not waitress. "Ma'am." The word rippled through the evening like a stone dropped into still water. Each new group of Marines who entered the diner carried the story with them, passed down through the barracks grapevine with the speed and distortion of all military legends, growing in detail with each retelling but never losing its essential core. The waitress at Rosie's was someone. The specifics varied depending on the teller, but the respect was constant. Cooks who had never tipped began leaving cash under their plates. Officers who had never noticed the diner's existence began stopping in for coffee. A gunnery sergeant from 3rd Battalion brought his entire platoon for dinner and quietly instructed them, before they walked through the door, that they would conduct themselves as if they were guests in the home of a superior officer, because in every way that mattered, they were. Maria Santos watched the transformation from behind her register and said nothing, because some changes were best honored with silence rather than commentary. She had added a second photograph to her wall beside the clipping and the masking tape declaration. It was a snapshot she had taken with her phone on the night of the incident. Elle's hands, mid-compression, on Merritt's chest. The photograph was slightly blurred, the lighting was terrible, and it was the most powerful image that had ever hung on the walls of Rosie's diner. Tommy Chen came to work wearing a new determination in his posture. He had not enlisted. He had not decided against it. He had decided that the decision deserved more thought than he had previously given it, and in the meantime, he was going to learn everything he could from the woman who had taught him, in a single sentence, the difference between serving for recognition and serving because the work itself was enough. On the 3rd Friday after the incident, Briggs walked into the diner alone. No entourage, no Drake, no Cross, no Jennings. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a plain gray shirt, and he moved through the room with the careful deliberation of a man re-entering a place where he had caused damage and was not yet certain of his welcome. He sat at the counter. He ordered black coffee. When Elle brought it, he wrapped both hands around the cup and stared into the dark surface as if searching for the right words in the reflection. "I signed up for the Combat Lifesaver course," he said. "Starts next week. 40 hours of tactical combat casualty care." Elle set the coffee pot down. She looked at him with the same level assessment she had given him on the night they met, but the content of the assessment had changed. She was no longer measuring threat. She was measuring something else, something that required a more delicate instrument. "First lesson they'll teach you," she said. "Learn to see people before you judge them." Briggs nodded. The nod was small and carried the weight of a man accepting a correction that he knew he deserved. "Yes, ma'am." He drank his coffee. He left a $20 tip on a $3 cup. He walked out without looking back, and the bell above the door chimed in his wake, with a sound that might have been closure or might have been a beginning, depending on which direction you were listening from. Wallace found Elle outside during her break, leaning against the brick wall of the diner in the same spot where Harlan had made his phone call 3 weeks earlier. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in bands of amber and vermilion that made the ocean look like it was on fire. "I want you to know something," Wallace said, positioning himself beside her with the comfortable distance of a man who respected boundaries. "What you did that night didn't just save the colonel. It changed how an entire diner full of people look at each other." He turned to face her. 23 people watched a woman they'd been ignoring all night turn out to be the most important person in the room. That doesn't just go away. That rearranges things. Elle watched the sunset. The light caught the edge of the surgical scar on her wrist and turned it gold. "I was just doing my job, Sergeant." Wallace smiled. It was a quiet smile, the kind that conveyed understanding rather than amusement. "That's exactly what I mean." He walked back inside, and Elle remained against the wall, watching the sun descend into the Pacific with the unhurried attention of a woman who had learned to find beauty in the intervals between crises. The challenge coin was in her pocket. She could feel its weight against her thigh, a small, constant reminder that the dead do not stay silent when their children carry their names forward. Harlan's report to Colonel Reeves included a final assessment that deviated from standard military prose in both tone and content. He wrote, Petty Officer First Class Vasquez demonstrates sustained operational readiness despite extended separation from active service. Her clinical skills remain at the highest level. Her tactical awareness is undiminished. Her capacity for leadership under pressure exceeds any metric available for measurement. Recommend immediate reinstatement at rank commensurate with capability. Personal observation. She has been hiding in plain sight not because she is broken, but because she has not yet found a reason to stop hiding. If the Corps wants her back, it will need to provide that reason. An order will not suffice. The evening after Wallace's conversation, Elle closed the diner for the last time. Maria walked her to the door, held her by both shoulders, and looked at her with the fierce tenderness of a woman who had lost a husband to war and understood that the people who survived it carried their own kind of casualties. You come back whenever you need to, mija. This kitchen is always yours. Elle embraced her. The hug lasted 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than any physical contact Elle had initiated in 7 months, and it contained the compressed gratitude of a person who had found shelter in an unexpected place and was now preparing to step back into the weather. She walked to her apartment, she climbed the stairs, she opened the door. The room was exactly as she had left it, map on the wall, photographs pinned in formation, laptop closed on the desk, challenge coin beside it, catching the last light of the day through the window. She sat at the desk and opened the laptop. The encrypted channel loaded. She composed a message. Phoenix reporting. Principal discharged from medical. Resumed normal activities. Cover identity compromised beyond recovery. Requesting extraction and reassignment. She stared at the message for a long time. Then she deleted the last line and retyped it. Requesting guidance on long-term positioning. Willing to transition to overt protective detail if authorized. She sent the message and closed the laptop. She picked up the challenge coin. She opened the desk drawer. Inside the drawer, arranged with the organizational precision of a person for whom disorder was a form of vulnerability, were the following items: a Sig Sauer P320 compact pistol in a molded holster, 2 medical journals with pages marked in blue pen, and a photograph. The photograph showed a group of 14 people in combat gear standing in front of a mud-walled compound in a landscape that was all dust and sky and the particular shade of brown that meant Afghanistan. Their faces were tired and proud and young, and they wore the expressions of people who had just accomplished something that could not be discussed and would not be forgotten. Elle stood in the center of the group, smaller than everyone else, her medical bag slung across her body, a smile on her face that the woman in the apartment had not worn in 2 years. 3 of the faces in the photograph had been marked with red X's: Rodriguez, Jenkins, Walsh. The 3 she could not save. She looked at the photograph, then she looked at the coin, then she looked at the pistol.
Sentinel Event Services contract with the Buckhead Grand Hotel is suspended effective tonight, pending investigation. Royce was no longer at the security desk. He had moved to the ballroom's east exit and was standing with his back against the wall, arms crossed, face carrying the particular stillness of a man who is not processing information, but waiting for it to stop. Second, Celeste Hargrove, VP of Foundation Development. Ms. Hargrove is placed on administrative leave from the Lorraine Amos Foundation, effective tonight. An HR investigation will examine workplace conduct toward venue service staff during Foundation events, including but not limited to the incidents documented at 9:02 p.m. and 8:22 p.m. this evening. Ms. Hargrove's employment records will be reviewed for prior complaints. Celeste's champagne flute was no longer in her hand. It sat on the nearest table, abandoned, the bubbles dying in the glass the way bubbles die, slowly, individually, until the surface is flat and still. Third, Duncan Merritt, CFO. Mr. Merritt's trespass advisory, issued at approximately 6:30 p.m., has been forwarded to the Foundation's General Counsel for review. The document contains a physical description and a venue policy citation, but does not record the subject's verbal response, which included a citation of Georgia Code Section 16721 and a challenge to the advisory's legal basis. This omission may constitute a material discrepancy in an official record. The Foundation's counsel will assess potential liability for wrongful detention. Duncan's clipboard remained on the floor. No one had picked it up. It lay face down on the marble, the pages fanned open, the pen that had written Cedric's physical description rolling slowly toward the nearest table leg. Fourth, Commissioner Wayne Strickland. The Commissioner's 911 call, placed at 9:03 p.m. from the hotel lobby, has been transcribed from Fulton County dispatch records. The transcript will be submitted to the Atlanta Police Department's Office of Professional Standards for internal review. Filing a police report using governmental credentials to remove an individual from a public access venue, absent probable cause or articulable criminal activity, raises questions under Federal Statute 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. Deprivation of rights under color of law. The Commissioner's office will receive formal notice on Monday. Strickland did not move. His aide had stopped typing. The statement draft, whatever it said, whatever language it used to reframe a 911 call as a security concern, would need to be rewritten. The 911 transcript was a public record. The dispatch recording was a public record. The credential number Strickland had cited was now part of an official complaint that would exist in APD's files for as long as files exist. Fifth, Margot lifted a spreadsheet from the attaché case. Jeanette Caldwell, board treasurer. The Foundation's restricted fund audit has identified a disbursement discrepancy of $1.2 million over 18 months. Funds designated for 12 community grants were rerouted to Caldwell Consulting Group, LLC, a single-member limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware 3 months after Ms. Caldwell joined the Foundation's board. Restricted funds under 26 U.S.C. Section 501, subsection C, paragraph 3, cannot be diverted to private benefit without triggering excess benefit transaction penalties under Section 4958. An IRS Form 13909, tax-exempt organization complaint, has been prepared. The referral will be filed Monday morning. $1.2 million. The number moved through the room differently from the earlier figure. $47 million was an abstraction, a number so large it existed as concept rather than currency. $1.2 million was specific, tangible. It was the number of denied grant applications, the number of literacy programs unfunded, the number of youth mentorship slots that existed as brochure photographs rather than serve children. It was the distance between what the Foundation promised and what it delivered, measured in dollars that had traveled from restricted accounts to a shell company in Delaware and had never come back. Jeanette Caldwell was gone. The side exit had closed behind her 4 minutes ago. Her sapphire pendant was not visible. Her attorney was not visible. Her phone, which had been face down on table 1, screen dark, was not visible. They had left the building the way people leave buildings when the building has stopped protecting them. Sixth and final. Margot closed the attaché case. Mr. Amos has authorized an independent forensic audit of the Lorraine Amos Foundation. All financial records, grant disbursements, vendor contracts, and board member disclosures for the past 3 fiscal years will be examined by an independent accounting firm selected by trustee council. Results will be published publicly. The Foundation's governance structure will be restructured. Community seats will be added to the board. Compensation disclosures will be required for all board members and senior staff, and an annual independent audit will be mandated going forward. She stepped back from the podium. The attaché case was closed. The documents had been read. The findings had been delivered. The evening, which had been designed to celebrate generosity and community investment and the transformative power of giving, was over. What remained was not celebration. It was reckoning. Slow, procedural, and inevitable. The jazz ensemble did not resume playing. The string quartet's instruments sat on their stands, untouched, the bows resting on the music stands at angles that suggested their players had set them down quickly and had not returned. The champagne trays sat on the catering tables, the flutes half full, the bubbles gone flat. The room smelled of perfume and anxiety and the particular chemical compound that human bodies produce when the social order they depend on inverts without warning. Cedric stepped away from the podium. Nadine stood beside him, still in the stained uniform, still carrying the rag, still wearing the badge that read Nadine. Two people on a stage built for speeches about partnership and lifting the underserved, standing in front of a 12-foot projection of the name of a woman who had cleaned the floors beneath their feet. He did not smile. He did not shake hands. He walked off the stage the same way he had walked through the building all night, steadily, without hurry, without apology, wearing the coat that cost $11 and carrying the memory of a bread roll that cost nothing and meant everything. Nadine followed, then stopped, looked back at the room. 300 faces looking at her, some with shock, some with shame, some with the particular expression of people who are already composing the version of this story they will tell tomorrow, the version in which they were not part of the problem, the version in which they always knew something was wrong, the version in which their silence was not complicity but caution. She did not speak to them. She turned and walked off the stage, cleaning rag still in her back pocket, badge still crooked, shoes still damp, hands still calloused, still stained, still the hands of a woman who had shared her only meal with a stranger, because that was who she was before this evening, and who she would be after it, regardless of what title was given to her on Monday. The ballroom emptied slowly, guests left in clusters, voices low, phones out, the digital machinery of reputation management already spinning. Donors texted attorneys. Board members texted each other. Celeste's assistant called Celeste's phone. No answer. Duncan retrieved his clipboard from the floor, looked at it, set it on the nearest table, and walked out through the main entrance without speaking to anyone. Strickland's town car was waiting at the curb. He entered it without comment. The door closed. The window stayed up. The car pulled into Atlanta traffic and disappeared into the city's late evening flow, carrying a commissioner and a 911 transcript, and a career that was now measured in news cycles rather than election cycles. Royce Pemberton stood alone in the empty service corridor, the same corridor where he had pinned a man against a wall 90 minutes ago. The camera above him recorded his stillness the way it had recorded his violence, without judgment, without mercy, with the impartial precision of a lens that does not care who is watching. The gala is over, but the story is not. What happens in the next 48 hours will determine whether justice arrives, or whether the system protects its own, the way it always has. Stay until the end. 48 hours later, the machinery of accountability produced its first outputs, each one stamped with the institutional language of organizations that acknowledge wrongdoing without admitting fault. Royce Pemberton's employer, Sentinel Event Services, LLC, released a 2-paragraph statement on Monday afternoon. The first paragraph expressed deep concern regarding allegations of inappropriate conduct by a member of our team. The second paragraph announced that Royce had been placed on administrative reassignment pending the completion of an internal review. Administrative reassignment. Not suspension, not termination. Reassignment. The word suggested motion without consequence, the organizational equivalent of moving furniture from one room to another and calling it renovation. Sentinel's contract with the Buckhead Grand Hotel was under review, the hotel's legal department using the same phrase that institutions use when they want to signal action without committing to it, under review. As if the corridor camera footage, which Margot's preservation order had secured 43 minutes before the deletion process completed, were a matter of interpretation rather than evidence. Celeste Hargrove's administrative leave was confirmed Monday morning by the Foundation's interim board chair, a role now held by Margot Fontaine herself, pending governance restructuring. The leave was with pay. It carried no admission of wrongdoing and no specific return date. Celeste's attorney released a statement calling the situation a misunderstanding amplified by unusual circumstances, and expressing confidence that the facts will demonstrate Ms. Hargrove's professionalism and commitment to the Foundation's mission. The statement did not address the wine spill, the finger snap, the on-your-knees instruction, or the cart collision. It addressed a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding, the word institutions use when the understanding is precisely the problem. Duncan Merritt remained in his CFO position. The Foundation's general counsel had requested his formal statement regarding the trespass advisory, specifically the absence of a subject response field and the omission of Cedric's legal challenge. Duncan retained personal counsel on Monday morning. His counsel advised him not to provide a statement until the scope of the investigation was defined. The scope was being defined. It was expanding. Commissioner Wayne Strickland released a public statement through his communications office at 2:15 p.m. on Monday. The statement was 4 sentences long. The commissioner acted out of genuine concern for the safety and security of event attendees. At no time did the commissioner intend to target any individual based on race, appearance, or socioeconomic status. The commissioner is committed to cooperating with any review conducted by appropriate oversight bodies. He considers the matter addressed and looks forward to continuing his service to the city of Atlanta. The statement did not contain the word apology. It did not contain the word error. It contained the word addressed, a word that means resolved only if the person using it gets to define resolution. It did not mention the 911 transcript, the credential number, the physical description, or the phrase, "looked like he wandered in off Peachtree." These details existed in the dispatch recording, which was a public record, which meant they existed permanently whether the commissioner addressed them or not. A PD's Office of Professional Standards opened a case file. No officer had been dispatched to the Buckhead Grand. The 12-minute ETA unit had been redirected when the hotel's front desk informed dispatch that the situation had been resolved internally, but the 911 call remained in the system. It would be reviewed. The estimated timeline, 3 to 6 months. The probable outcome, a letter. The letter would note the call, acknowledge the review, and recommend continued training on community engagement protocols. The letter would be filed. It would change nothing, but it would exist. Jeanette Caldwell retained white-collar defense counsel from a mid-size Atlanta firm, whose client list included 2 former state legislators and a hospital administrator who had pleaded no contest to Medicare fraud in 2022. Her counsel filed a motion to quash the Foundation's request for financial records, citing attorney-client privilege and arguing that the restricted fund discrepancy was an accounting methodology difference rather than evidence of diversion. The motion would be heard in Fulton County Superior Court in approximately 6 weeks. In the meantime, Caldwell Consulting Group, LLC's Delaware registration remained active, its bank account remained open, and the $1.2 million remained unaccounted for. The IRS Form 13909 was filed Monday morning at 9:17 a.m. electronically through the IRS's Tax-Exempt and Government Entities Division portal. Processing time, 6 to 18 months. The form contained 17 pages of supporting documentation, including bank statements, grant disbursement records, and a timeline correlating Caldwell Consulting Group's formation date with Jeanette's appointment to the board. The IRS would review it, eventually, on its schedule, at its pace. Justice, when it involves the Internal Revenue Service, moves at the speed of bureaucracy, which is to say, it moves, but you cannot see it moving, and by the time it arrives, the landscape it was responding to has often changed beyond recognition. The forensic audit was underway. The independent firm, retained Sunday evening before the Monday news cycle began, had already requested access to the Foundation's financial servers, its vendor payment system, its grant management database, and 3 years of board meeting minutes. Jeanette's counsel objected to the scope. Margot's counsel overruled the objection, citing the trustee's fiduciary authority under the Trust Deeds Article 7, an article Jeanette had apparently never read, or had read and forgotten, or had read and assumed would never be enforced. Nadine Osei sat in her new office on Tuesday morning. Small, windowless. 5th floor of a mid-rise on Peachtree Center Avenue, between a tax preparation franchise and a nonprofit that provided legal aid to tenants facing eviction. The desk had been cleared of its previous occupants' belongings. A VP of programs who had resigned Sunday night via email, citing personal reasons, which was the euphemism people use when the reason is that they knew about the financial irregularities and chose not to report them. Her name was on the door, spelled correctly. Nadine Osei, Community Director. The nameplate was new, installed Monday afternoon by a maintenance worker who had measured the placement twice, centered it, stepped back, measured again. The precision was either professional habit or the particular care people bring to tasks they suspect are being observed by someone important. On her desk, a stack of grant applications. 3 fiscal years, unfunded. The first application was from a literacy program for formerly incarcerated women in College Park, a neighborhood 12 miles south of the Buckhead Grand Hotel and an economic universe away. The program had requested $42,000 for instructor salaries, classroom materials, and childcare during evening sessions. Status: denied. Reason: insufficient allocation. The denial was dated 4 months after Jeanette Caldwell's LLC received a $380,000 consulting fee from the same restricted fund. Nadine read the application, then the next, then the next. Each one was a request for money that existed, from a community that needed it, denied by a system that had redirected the funds to a Delaware LLC with 1 member and no employees and no office address, and no evidence of any consulting service ever performed. She was terrified. And determined. And sitting in a windowless office with a nameplate spelled correctly for the first time in 11 months, holding the authority to audit every dollar that had been stolen from communities that looked exactly like the one where she grew up. The phone rang. She answered. Cedric's voice, brief, professional, confirming budget authority, staffing allocation, reporting structure. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. It was the conversation of 2 people adjusting to a new dynamic, a dynamic that had been forged in a break room under fluorescent light, over half a bread roll, and was now being formalized in the language of organizational charts and fiscal year budgets. Before hanging up, a pause. The kind of pause that holds something unsaid, something that exists in the space between what 2 people know about each other and what they have not yet found the words to name. The bread was stale, by the way. Cedric's voice carried the first warmth Nadine had heard from him. Not humor exactly, but the recognition that humor was possible, that the evening they had shared could produce laughter as well as testimony. Everything good in that kitchen is stale. She heard herself responding before she had decided to respond. You should try the apple. I remember. The line went quiet, then disconnected. Nadine set the phone down, looked at the stack of applications, looked at the nameplate on the door, looked at her hands, still calloused, still carrying the faint red shadow of wine stain that would take another 2 days to fade completely. The following morning, Wednesday, Margot called with an update that was not an update but a warning. Jeanette's personal email. We flagged a message sent at 12:14 a.m. the night of the gala, approximately 3 hours after the reveal. The recipient is an email address registered to a domain called Orion Fiduciary Group. The domain registration routes through a Delaware holding entity that we have not yet been able to trace to a natural person. Subject line was redacted by her counsel before we obtained the metadata. The attachment, whatever it was deleted from the server before our forensic team could recover it. A pause. Margot's pauses were never empty. They were the intervals in which a trust attorney calculates the distance between what she knows and what she can prove. Orion Fiduciary Group does not appear in the Foundation's vendor records. It does not appear in any filing we have on record. It is a name connected to a domain, connected to an entity, connected to nothing we can currently identify. But someone received that email at 12:14 a.m., 3 hours after Jeanette Caldwell watched her embezzlement exposed in front of 300 people. And whatever was in that attachment was important enough to send at midnight and important enough to delete before anyone could read it. The thread was loose, unresolved. The kind of thread that forensic auditors follow for months, sometimes years, sometimes to dead ends, sometimes to revelations that restructure the entire case. Margot would follow it. That was what trust attorneys did. They followed threads. But the thread was there, and someone at the other end of it had received a midnight email from a woman whose foundation accounts had just been exposed and had destroyed the evidence before sunrise. The second unresolved thread arrived Thursday. The hotel's East Wing service corridor camera, the camera Cedric had identified at 7 p.m., the camera that had recorded Royce's assault at 9:14 p.m., the camera whose 72-hour overwrite schedule Cedric had cited in the break room, had a gap. Margot's preservation order had secured the footage before the full deletion completed, but the secured footage contained a 10-minute void, 9:11 p.m. to 9:21 p.m. The battery occurred at 9:14 p.m. The 10-minute window enclosed it precisely. The hotel's IT director, the person responsible for the security camera system's administration, was on vacation. He had departed Atlanta on a flight to Cancun on Sunday morning, approximately 12 hours after the gala. His out-of-office reply cited pre-planned personal travel. His phone went to voicemail. His personal email bounced. His office at the Buckhead Grand was locked, and the hotel's general manager stated that access to the IT director's workstation required a warrant or the director's personal authorization, neither of which was currently available. Someone had accessed the camera system at 9:19 p.m., 5 minutes after the assault, and initiated a deletion of the precise 10-minute window that contained the footage. The IP address traced to a device on the hotel's internal network. The device registration was incomplete, a placeholder entry in the system's access log, the kind of record that exists when someone uses a device that has not been formally assigned to a user. Margot filed a supplemental preservation order with Fulton County Superior Court on Thursday afternoon, requesting forensic examination of the hotel's camera server, the IT director's workstation, and all access logs for the evening of the gala. The court's timeline for hearing the motion, approximately 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, the IT director's vacation might end, or it might extend. The access logs might be preserved, or they might be overwritten by routine maintenance. The gap in the footage might be explained, or it might remain a void. 10 minutes of missing evidence in a corridor where a man was assaulted for the crime of existing in a space that decided he did not belong. The forensic audit continued. The IRS complaint sat in a federal queue. The DA's office had not announced charges. Celeste was on paid leave with no return date. Strickland was preparing for a re-election campaign that now included a 911 transcript in its opposition research file. Royce Pemberton was on administrative reassignment, which meant he was sitting at home on full salary, waiting for a review that might take 3 months and might conclude that his conduct was within protocol, because the protocol had never been written to account for the possibility that the man being shoved against a wall owned the building. Tuesday morning, 7:45 a.m. Nadine arrived at her office 15 minutes early, the habit of someone who has never had the luxury of arriving on time, who has spent her working life in buildings where lateness is a firing offense and earliness is invisible, who has learned that the only way to be safe is to be present before the clock starts counting. She unlocked the door, turned on the fluorescent light, the same frequency as the break room, the same 60-cycle hum, a sound she would hear differently from now on, because it was no longer the sound of a break she could not afford to extend, but the sound of an office where she made decisions. She stopped. On her desk, a bread roll, placed on a white napkin, centered with the kind of precision that belongs to someone who folds coats with creases sharp enough to cast shadows, who parks in the same spot every shift, who arrives at 6:01 p.m. because precision is not a habit but a language, the language of a man who was raised by a woman who pressed her own uniform before sitting down to rest because she believed that the dignity of stillness required a separation from the labor that earned it. No note, no card, no wrapper, no signature, just a bread roll on a napkin on a desk in a windowless office on Peachtree Center Avenue, where the morning light did not enter because there was no window, but the fluorescent tube hummed its 60-cycle hum, and the nameplate on the door said, Nadine Osei, and the stack of denied grant applications sat on the chair waiting for someone who finally had the authority to fund them. She picked it up, held it. The roll was fresh, not stale, not dense, not the discounted end-of-day product the Buckhead Grand served its cleaning staff. This was good bread. Bakery bread. The kind of bread that someone had gone to a specific place to buy at a specific time to deliver to a specific desk before 7:45 a.m., because the gesture required the same precision that governed everything else in Cedric Amos's life, deliberate, exact, and calibrated to say more than words could carry. She did not eat it. She set it on the edge of her desk, where the fluorescent light caught it and made it glow. A small, ordinary thing that meant everything and proved nothing, and promised something that neither of them had said out loud yet. Outside, Atlanta moved. Traffic built on Peachtree. The foundation's phone began ringing. Grant applicants who had heard the news, community organizations requesting meetings, a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution asking for comment on the Gala, a second reporter from WSB-TV requesting an interview, a call from the college park literacy program, whose $42,000 application had been denied during a fiscal year when Jeanette Caldwell's LLC had received $380,000. The machinery of accountability grinding forward, slowly, unevenly, with the friction that institutions generate when they are forced to examine themselves, the same friction that produces heat and delay, and occasionally, in rare and hard-won cases, something that resembles change. But Nadine Osei had a bread roll on her desk, and a stack of denied applications on her chair, and a door with her name spelled correctly on it for the first time in 11 months. And somewhere across the city, in a rental apartment on Edgewood Avenue, a man in a 12-year-old Honda Accord was reading the same denied applications on his laptop, cross-referencing them against Jeanette Caldwell's consulting invoices, building a case that would take months to complete and might never fully close. Because justice, real justice, the kind that changes systems rather than punishing individuals, does not arrive in a single evening. It arrives in increments, in audits, in filed complaints and preservation orders and forensic examinations and the slow, exhausting work of proving what everyone already knows, but no one has documented. The gala was over. The work was beginning. And the bread, stale the first time, fresh the second, split once in a break room and placed once on a desk, shared between two people the room forgot, remained the truest thing that happened in the Buckhead Grand Hotel on the night of October 14th. Not the speeches, not the champagne, not the 12-foot projection of a name on a screen. The bread, the breaking of it, the silence that followed, and the promise, neither will I, that turned out to be the only promise the entire evening kept.